Shortly after 7 a.m. on June the 30th, 1908, in the cold vastness of central Siberia near the Tunguska River, farmers, herdsmen, and trappers watched in awe as a round and cylindrical object glowing with a blinding white light and a fiery tail streaked across the morning horizon. At the time, the object was 6 to 10 kilometers above the ground, directly over a desolate region of tundra and pine forest. At 7:17, the unknown object exploded in a tremendous ball of fire, completely destroying an area of over 2,000 square kilometers, equivalent to an area larger than Los Angeles or New York City. The resulting firestorms lasted for several weeks, burning an additional 10,000 kilometers surrounding the flashpoint. This explosion could be felt several thousand kilometers away. Strangely, though, upon investigation of this location 19 years later, no impact crater of any kind was found. No one, until now, knew exactly what the object was that caused this massive explosion. Even after 90 years of investigation of this crash site by thousands of renowned expert scientists from Russia and dozens of other countries, there is still no consensus or even a loose agreement among scientists as to exactly what the object was or of its origin. Recently, thousands of participants at an international space convention held in Bologna, Italy, failed to grasp any further understanding or form any unilateral scientific explanation whatsoever regarding the phenomenon. Professor N.V. Vasilev, chairman of the Scientific Organizing Committee of the Russian Academy of Sciences, admitted during this convention that it was most remarkable that the explosion was of a non-terrestrial object of still unknown origin, and that an unambiguous comprehensive solution has still not been achieved to address all of the problems involved in a logical scientific explanation.
A group of scientists found the impact point, and they found something very interesting, namely a forest that for many square miles had been knocked down, and all the trees were pointing radially away from the impact point. And at the impact point was a great big hole in the ground. Now, what's interesting about it is nothing was found of whatever caused the impact. There is the forest torn down, there's the great big holes, and nothing else.
Interestingly, the cumulative available evidence both supports and contradicts all of the explanations previously put forward to account for the explosion. Conflicting evidence supports many of the competing proposals, ranging from that of an asteroid, a comet, antimatter particles, contact with a mini black hole, and even a futuristic weapon discharge. Furthermore, some evidence that was apparently collected several years ago by Russian scientists had been confiscated and concealed by the Ministry of State Security, later to be known as the KGB, without a trace or an explanation. This program presents, for the first time, an account of this mysterious explosion by one of the last surviving eyewitnesses, and furthermore exposes the fallacies in the current scientific theories and explanations put forth to interpret what actually happened in Tunguska on that fateful morning in 1908. A colonel in the former Soviet Union's KGB now admits to being an accessory to a covert Russian cover-up to suppress and conceal crucial evidence. He further explains his role in the government scheme to conceal the conclusions reached by many Russian scientists as to the actual true nature of this explosion. That being that Tunguska actually bears the scars of an authentic 90-year-old crash site of an interplanetary spaceship of extraterrestrial origin. The role of the Russian government in attempting to conceal the truth about this event, as well as the virtual impossibility of explaining this event by any known natural means, seems almost identical to the event that occurred in 1947 in the United States near Roswell, New Mexico. And with all the evidence considered, Tunguska may very well represent the Russian Roswell. Just prior to the Tunguska explosion in 1908, observatories and meteorologists around the world noted a series of atmospheric oddities, such as the formation and movement of unusual clouds, as well as an unusually strong aurora borealis and solar halos, among many others. No one was able to directly connect these atmospheric oddities with the Tunguska object. However, the coincidences in time between the sudden occurrence of the strange atmospheric activity followed by the explosion strongly suggests that they must have been connected in some way.
Я была ребенком. Я работала с папой на ферме.
I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time I saw it with my father. We were farming in a little village near the railroad tracks, and I'll never forget how it looked like a long, round chimney on its side with a long tail of fire. I remember telling everybody I could that it looked at first like it was coming down, but then angled up for a little while, and then I was absolutely positive that it had changed its direction.
As many as 900 eyewitnesses living near the crash site gave similar accounts shortly after the explosion. Collectively, their stories made the trajectory difficult to explain in a logical scientific manner, since it indicated a maneuvering object. Physically, it is impossible for a meteor or a comet to fall through the Earth's atmosphere, being pulled by gravity, then change direction. Whatever the phenomenon may have been, it did not behave like any naturally occurring object.
It disappeared over the next mountain ridge. And I remember like it was yesterday, how a few seconds later it seemed like the entire world ended. There was a flash that filled the entire sky, and it was like the sky opened up and split in half. I put my hands over my eyes and I could see the bones in my hands.
In modern terms, the blast was equivalent to 40 megatons, approximately the size of the largest thermonuclear bomb. The explosion was so massive, it was over 2,000 times the explosive power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Given the remoteness of the area, the onset of World War I, and the internal conflicts within Russia, which resulted in communist revolution, it wasn't until 1927 that an expedition was mounted to investigate the crash site. Upon arrival at the site, the members of this expedition were awestruck to witness the carnage and extent of the devastation that still existed 19 years after the event. Trees the size of telephone poles were snapped like toothpicks. The fallen trees were arranged in a radial pattern away from a central point, like the spokes of a bicycle wheel. There was no crater and no trace of a large meteorite found anywhere. There were, however, many small pieces of metallic fragments embedded in the felled trees which were collected for analysis. In addition, many people living near the explosion site were reported to have died of an unknown illness, showing symptoms not previously documented in that region.
I could not get over the fact that so many of my friends and family were getting sick, and many of them died when still young. They were healthy before, and I just could not figure out why they got sick and died.
Another occurrence that could not be explained by any natural means at that time was when the observatory, located 900 kilometers away in Irkutsk, Siberia, recorded very unusual disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field at the time of the explosion, as well as severe magnetic storms occurring just after the explosion. Satisfactory explanations for both the explosion and the resulting abnormalities were impossible until after World War II. Following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, aerial photographs of these cities were compared with aerial photographs of the Tunguska crash site. They were surprisingly and stunningly similar, with the notable exception that the Tunguska site was tremendously larger by comparison. In addition, people living near the two bomb blasts in Japan exhibited identical symptoms to those from Tunguska. Many experts came to believe that the people who died of the strange illness near Tunguska did so as a result of radiation poisoning.
Stalin узнал о случившемся между Тунгуской и Хиросима.
When Stalin found out about the similarities between Tunguska and Hiroshima, he went absolutely nuts. He thought it could have been some UFO testing a new weapon that he could make use of, or something that could be used against the Americans. Stalin just wanted to know what the hell went on out there, and for someone to sort all of that out.
In July of 1947, Stalin himself gave instructions to the head of the Ministry of State Security, later to become the KGB, to investigate Tunguska and involve the world's foremost rocket scientist and designer, S.P. Korolev, who was later to become the father and head of the Russian space program. Once the Russians acquired the technology to explode thermonuclear weapons, they conducted numerous experiments and test detonations high in the atmosphere. They found that such explosions in the atmosphere had the effect of disrupting the Earth's magnetic field, causing geomagnetic storms, seemingly identical to those of the Irkutsk readings of the Tunguska explosion of 1908. Further evidence of a nuclear blast and residual radiation debris fallout was revealed some years later, when Russian scientists and experts found that virtually all of the trees at Tunguska underwent an abnormal accelerated growth rate for several years subsequent to the blast. This was determined to be the result of genetic mutations caused by radiation exposure. Korolev himself supported and equipped an expedition to investigate the explosion at Tunguska. By the late 1950s, a number of expeditions confirmed finding residual traces of radiation throughout the entire blast region. Based on the lack of any unambiguous evidence to explain this event by any natural means, Korolev concluded that the blast had been caused by the crash of an extraterrestrial vehicle. On October 4, 1959, over 51 years after the Tunguska explosion, the event earned a belated spot on the front page of the New York Times. Russian scientists were reporting the discovery of radiation at the site, as well as the conflicting evidence found to explain the explosion by any natural means. Their collective conclusion was that the event was a nuclear explosion caused by an object of extraterrestrial origin.
Once radiation traces were found out there, my superiors instructed a team of us to lock down the whole place and to take possession of all objects that were ever collected from the site. We told all of the people there who saw the object years ago to say that it was only a big meteor. Otherwise, they would get a free ticket to a Siberian prison camp. We thought for sure that we would find some alien body parts, or spacecraft chunks, or nuclear bomb parts. And the last thing we wanted to do was to share any findings with the Americans.
Soon afterward, many of the scientists involved in this investigation lost their jobs or were invited by the KGB to a long-term expedition deep in Siberia. TASS, the Soviet government-controlled newspaper media, did an about-face and changed their official story and stating that the explosion wasn't a UFO after all, but simply must have been a comet or an asteroid.
We did collect some papers and samples of odd-shaped metal and rock pieces, but I never did find out whatever happened to any of that, or whether or not anyone else found out about what the story was. all I was told to do was to have people not say that it was a UFO. We had all of the materials sent to a secret military base just south of Vanovara in Siberia, but I don't know what happened to it since then.
For over 3 generations, the Russians have successfully kept the truth from the world about this event. As a result, scientists and experts have been spinning their wheels attempting to explain the Tunguska explosion and crash site by natural means. The most popular of these explanations put forth for this event is that it was caused by either a small asteroid or comet. Both comets and asteroids are essentially the leftover debris from the birth of our solar system over 4.5 billion years ago, when the sun and planets formed from a ball of dust that remained after the explosion of a star.
There's another population whose existence was only discovered about 65 years ago, and that's the Earth-crossing asteroid population. The population of Earth-crossing asteroids constitute a giant swarm of objects, which may be as numerous almost as the main asteroid belt. It's just that we haven't discovered very many of them. It's just an enormous population. You have tens of millions, maybe 100 million, which are larger than a small house. It's just a huge swarm. Every once in a very long while, they can collide with our planet. The asteroid collision hazards are real.
As a result of the overlapping orbits of these Earth-crossing asteroids, tens of thousands of collisions have occurred throughout the course of Earth's history. One of the explanations offered by scientists is that an asteroid about the size of a 25-story building, comprised of a loose conglomeration of small rocks and minerals, entered the atmosphere on a collision course with the Earth. However, due to friction, the object heated up to several thousand degrees and came apart, exploding and disintegrating in a huge ball of fire. While it is altogether possible that a rock weighing about 1 million tons could create such explosive power and leave some radioactive traces, there are numerous problems and evidentiary contradictions that thwart this conclusion, even though that this explanation is the cleanest and simplest one to accept. Normally, when an asteroid enters the Earth's atmosphere, it would heat up to incredible temperatures, and if small, it would explode very high in the atmosphere, or if large, it would slam into the Earth, dredging up billions of tons of soil and rock.
Perhaps the best known example is Meteor Crater in Arizona. That was made by an impact of an iron object about 100 feet across. And it exploded with an energy that we can estimate from the crater itself as about 15 megatons, about the size of the largest nuclear bombs. It left a scar. It's 50,000 years old, and there are half a dozen other craters on the Earth of similar age that are also easily seen.
Virtually all of the other impact traces endured by the Earth are erased almost as quickly as they appear, such that all impacts, except the most recent, go unnoticed.
Any object larger than about 50 feet across, with an explosive energy then of the order of several megatons, equivalent to a large nuclear bomb, is able to penetrate through our atmosphere and to explode either in the lower atmosphere or at the surface. So when one of those penetrations takes place, we end up with the equivalent of a large nuclear bomb going off, which of course could do terrible damage.
It is almost inconceivable that an object the size of a 25-story building and weighing over 1 million tons would disintegrate into dust particles without leaving any debris of some sort. The Arizona crater was caused by a meteor that had to be only 1/4 the size of the one that caused the Tunguska explosion, and that one made it to the surface intact, which adds to the dubious nature of this explanation. Furthermore, a meteor would not be able to change course as many of the eyewitnesses claimed, nor would it be able to create the atmospheric oddities associated with the object. A relatively small meteor made up of a loose collection of rocks could not have disrupted the magnetic field or created geomagnetic storms as did the object in question.
Recently, the suggestion was made that it was actually a chunk of a comet that smashed into the Earth. And in fact, it never really hit the ground, but it blew up a mile or so above the surface. And that is exactly what you would expect of something frail, like a great big chunk of ice like that.
Comets are made of ice and rock. Their spectacular tails occur when the solar wind evaporates bits of ice and dust, and then blowing these particles back for millions of kilometers. Scientists believe there are trillions of comets beyond the furthest planet in a formation known as the Oort cloud, and that comets are periodically dislodged from their distant orbits and hurled towards the sun. Most comets make only one pass through the inner solar system during their lifetimes. The comet explanation does account for the atmospheric oddities, in that some of the material coming off of the comet tail could have reacted with the upper atmosphere prior to the entry and explosion. As with the asteroid or meteor impact theory, the comet theory also has numerous problems and contradictory evidence that tends to reject this explanation as well. Comets are defined by their brightness and long tails, so it is difficult to believe that a comet could sneak up on the Earth without any prior sightings from anywhere else on Earth. A comet consisting mainly of ice would not have been able to cause the geomagnetic storms or leave such radiation or be able to change course for that matter. Furthermore, comets are not known to contain radioactive material. Computer simulations clearly show that a comet of the size required to create such a blast would have disintegrated much higher in the atmosphere than the object that exploded over Tunguska. One of the more exotic explanations for the explosion is that particles of antimatter were formed over the Tunguska region and then exploded when they came in contact with the molecules in the atmosphere. It has been well documented in the scientific community that when antimatter particles come in contact with positive matter particles, they cancel each other out and can create a massive explosion. This proposal is based on the residual radiation left over after the explosion, the lack of a crater, and the lack of an observation of a mushroom cloud. This explanation, however, does not at all account for the atmospheric and geomagnetic oddities associated with the Tunguska explosion or the eyewitness observations of an object streaking across the sky, not to mention the lack of any rational explanation for where and how these antimatter particles formed over the region. These particles would doubtlessly have come into contact with the atmosphere much higher than the explosion. Hence, these inconsistencies and contradictory evidence clearly dismiss this theory as a possible explanation. One of the least likely natural phenomena proposed to cause this explosion was the possibility that a mini black hole came into contact with Tunguska. Black holes are tremendously dense objects, such that a mass the size of the Earth could fit into a space the size of a tennis ball and have the gravitational pull so strong as to affect even light waves. Since the gravitational forces and mass required to create a black hole would be so enormous, it is virtually impossible to get a pin-sized black hole, and any black hole that might theoretically be bigger and come close to Earth would most certainly have catastrophic effects on the entire planet. Therefore, this explanation can also be dismissed as having no relevant merits. Since the available evidence is contradictory and therefore rejecting the meteor or comet theory of origin, as well as other naturally occurring phenomena, some experts have proposed man-made causes for the explosion. Among the most publicized explanations is the theory that the explosion was caused by a high-energy electrical beam originating from the laboratory of Nikola Tesla in New York, and that he created the beam as a demonstration for Admiral Byrd at the North Pole. Apparently, according to this theory, Tesla overshot the mark and caused the Tunguska explosion. The national network broadcast TV program Sightings presented this explanation as the one and only means by which this explosion could have occurred. This theory is absolutely ludicrous and has very little merit at all. First, there were hundreds of eyewitnesses who saw an object hurtle through the upper atmosphere and then explode. Secondly, even our present-day technology cannot create the electrical energy required to mimic a thermonuclear blast of 40 megatons and completely destroy 2,000 square kilometers, not to mention projecting that amount of energy halfway around the world. Even if so great an electrical discharge could be generated, sending it into and through the fragile ionosphere would have ripped away and ionized half the planet's upper atmosphere and would have killed off all life on Earth. Furthermore, the pattern of tree destruction at Tunguska clearly indicates that it was a gigantic, high-altitude explosion rather than an electrical discharge. In addition, the electrical discharge would not have left long-term radiation at the site. Therefore, a Tesla weapon electrical energy discharge theory is also highly suspect and tremendously inconsistent with the available evidence. Of all the explanations previously proposed for this explosion, the only viable explanation for all of these variables, as well as accounting for the Russian government's cover-up, is that the Tunguska explosion was not natural in origin. As shocking as it may seem, it is now proposed that this event was the result of exploding nuclear or ion-powered engines belonging to an interplanetary spacecraft. The eyewitness account of an object descending, then angling upward slightly, can be explained by NASA's own study of spacecraft re-entering into the Earth's atmosphere. Re-entry can only be accomplished if done within a 2-degree angle of descent. If the spacecraft enters at too steep an angle, it disintegrates high in the atmosphere as a result of heat caused by friction. If the angle of re-entry is too shallow, the spacecraft descends, but goes back up and out of the atmosphere, much like a stone skipping across the surface of a pond. It is hypothesized that the spacecraft entered the atmosphere at too shallow an angle and was skipping out of the Earth's atmosphere when it attempted to change course but then exploded as a result of overheating and stress on the spacecraft. The explosion itself and the associated evidence is not at all consistent with a meteor or comet chemical explosion, but is consistent with a 40 megaton thermonuclear blast about 6 to 10 kilometers in the atmosphere. The residual radiation, people dying of radiation poisoning, the abnormal accelerated growth of the trees as a result of genetic mutation, the geomagnetic disturbances, the lack of an impact crater, the lack of any meteor fragments or comet debris, the suppressed collection of metallic fragments, and all other evidence concerning this crash site leaves only one theory intact. That is, the event occurring in Tunguska in 1908 was the result of an explosion of the nuclear or ion-powered engines of an interplanetary spacecraft. As early as the late 1960s, NASA had designed and test-fired nuclear engines for 21st century spacecraft, and continues to research the viability of nuclear-powered and ion-powered engines for interplanetary and interstellar travel. These engines would have to contain at least as much material on board which could conceivably cause a similar-sized detonation as that observed over Tunguska.
Well, NASA's been involved in the development of ion propulsion for over 30 years now, and very early they were able to demonstrate good engine performance. But because these engines have such low thrust levels compared to chemical rockets, very, very long burn times are required for typical planetary missions, on the order of 8,000 to 12,000 hours.
So the hardest part of working with ion propulsion is demonstrating that the engine has enough lifetime for those kinds of missions.
The design and concept for such a spacecraft is not at all science fiction. In fact, it will be the design of our own human expedition spaceships within the next 100 years or so. Small-scale early versions are already being built for unmanned probes that will reach the outer limits of our solar system and beyond.
The N-Star thruster will be used first on the first New Millennium mission, which is a comet and asteroid flyby. Subsequent missions in which it might be used would be small body rendezvous missions or perhaps outer planet missions.
In 1947, the United States government began a massive cover-up of an alien crash site at Roswell, New Mexico, and has for over 50 years continued its conspiracy to hide the truth from the American people. The reports of the U.S. military concealing both a recovered interplanetary spacecraft and alien occupants have made the Roswell crash site by far the most famous example of humanity's contact with extraterrestrial life and government cover-up. The Tunguska crash predates Roswell by nearly 4 decades. And even though no spacecraft or alien occupants were recovered, the suppression of facts and confiscation of materials collected from the site by the KGB, in addition to the discrediting of eyewitness accounts, bear striking similarities to the U.S. cover-up of the crash site at Roswell. It is only now, after the collapse of communism and breakup of the Soviet Union, as well as the warming relationship between the former Eastern and Western Bloc countries, that the true eyewitness accounts of the Tunguska explosion and subsequent cover-up are beginning to surface. It is hoped that the further warming of relationships between Russian and American politicians and scientists may ultimately allow for a release and an analysis of the confiscated metallic materials still hidden at the Siberian military base.
I've been invited to talk on such an important...
In light of this newly revealed evidence and the rejection of all natural explanations for this phenomenon, the crash site at Tunguska could very well represent the most significant and historic, yet the most overlooked and almost forgotten discovery in the history of humanity.